An old woman mocked by elitist shooters at the shooting range, unaware she's a legendary sniper. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the shooting range, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Inside, a group of young men, all in their 20s and early 30s, gathered at one of the most prestigious shooting ranges in the country. The place was a hub for elite shooters, many of whom had competed in national and international competitions. The air was filled with the sound of their voices, full of boastful laughter and confident chatter. These young men had been shooting for years. They were proud of their skills and didn't hesitate to tell anyone who would listen about their numerous victories and high scores. They adjusted their high-tech equipment, checking scopes, and fine-tuning their rifles with the kind of care that only comes from years of experience. To them, this was more than just a hobby, it was a lifestyle. One of the shooters, a tall man with a strong build and a cocky grin, cracked a joke about how easy the upcoming tournament would be. "At this rate, I'm thinking of just taking the trophy home now," he said with a wink, causing a ripple of laughter among the group. Another shooter, a little younger, chimed in, "You're already overconfident. Don't forget, there's always someone better." As they exchanged banter and continued preparing their rifles, the door to the range swung open. The group's chatter slowed as a woman walked in. She was elderly, with silver hair neatly tucked into a bun, and she wore simple clothes, nothing fancy, just a plain jacket and trousers. Her entrance was calm, almost unnoticed, but her presence had an aura of quiet confidence. She approached the counter with steady steps, carrying a small, unassuming bag in one hand. The shooters exchanged curious glances. The elderly woman was out of place in this high-tech shooting range. Most of the shooters here were younger, fitter, and equipped with the latest, most advanced gear. This woman seemed like she didn't belong. In fact, to them, she looked more like someone's grandmother who had wandered into the wrong place by mistake. "Can I help you?" the range attendant asked politely, unsure of what to expect from her. "I'd like to use a lane, please," she replied with a soft but clear voice. The words weren't rushed, but they carried a sense of purpose, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The attendant blinked for a moment before nodding. "Of course, please follow me." He guided her to a lane at the far end of the range. It was slightly away from the others, but still within view. The young shooters looked at one another, their smiles growing wider. They couldn't help but snicker. It wasn't that they were malicious, but the sight of an elderly woman walking into a shooting range filled with young, competitive men was simply too funny. The thought of her holding her own against them, with their state-of-the-art rifles and cutting-edge equipment, was laughable. One of the shooters, a thin man with glasses, whispered to his friend, "I bet she doesn't even know how to load a gun." They all laughed, the sound echoing across the range. A few of them shook their heads. The old woman, however, paid no attention to their comments. She simply followed the attendant to her lane and set down her bag. The mockery continued as she opened the bag, revealing an old rifle, one that looked like it had seen better days. The group continued their whispers and jokes. "Maybe she's come to watch us," one said. "Yeah, she probably doesn't even know what she's doing," another added. Their laughter grew louder as they continued to prepare for their own practice session. The woman, however, showed no signs of being fazed. She didn't rush her movements. She didn't seem to care about the attention she was getting. Instead, she took her time, carefully setting up her equipment, aligning the rifle, and adjusting her stance. Her focus was unwavering. As the shooters continued their preparations, they took note of her actions. She wasn't just standing around or fumbling with her gun. She was moving with a sense of purpose. There was something about her quiet confidence that made them pause for a moment, but it was quickly brushed aside. After all, she was old and they were in their prime. The cocky shooter with the strong build nudged the one next to him and grinned. "She probably doesn't even know the difference between a sniper rifle and a hunting rifle. Let's see if she can even hit a target." Another shooter laughed. "I'm betting she'll miss by a mile." Their words hung in the air, and yet the old woman remained calm, her hands steady as she continued her preparations. It was as though she had entered a world entirely different from theirs, a world where the noise, the laughter, and the mocking comments didn't reach her. Finally, she lifted the rifle to her shoulder and peered down the sights. Her eyes narrowed as she focused on the target in the distance. For a moment, everything seemed to go still. The young shooters, still unsure of what to make of the situation, kept watching, their curiosity growing. Would she actually take a shot? Would she be able to? The old woman was ready. The sound of her breath was steady, and her body moved with a grace that surprised everyone who had been watching her with skepticism. It was clear she wasn't here to entertain anyone, nor was she here to prove anything. She was simply here to shoot. The tension in the air was thick as the shooters silently watched, waiting for the first sign of what would happen next. The range was bustling with energy, the sounds of gunshots echoing in the background as the young shooters continued their warm-up. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, a reminder of the power and precision that came with each shot. They were all eager to prove themselves, each focused on their targets, as the sound of metal meeting metal rang out with every perfect shot. Yet none of them could escape the presence of the elderly woman standing quietly at the far end of the room, methodically setting up her equipment. As she loaded her rifle, there was no rush in her movements. She seemed perfectly at ease in the midst of the high-tech world that surrounded her. Her rifle, although old and worn, seemed to fit her hands like a familiar friend. She held it with steady hands, almost as if she were reconnecting with a long-lost part of herself. The young shooters, on the other hand, were adjusting their scopes, testing their triggers, and making sure their rifles were calibrated to perfection, their eyes darting between the targets and their companions. The elderly woman didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the snickers or the whispered jokes that were being thrown her way. She simply focused on the task ahead. Every now and then, she would glance down the range, her eyes scanning the targets in front of her. Her concentration was unwavering. To the others, it seemed like she was simply an old woman playing pretend in a world far beyond her reach. The shooters continued to watch, some of them still talking amongst themselves, others eyeing her suspiciously, wondering if she really knew what she was doing. The young man who had spoken earlier, the one who had made the most jokes about her, walked over to her lane with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You sure you know what you're doing, Grandma?" he asked with a sly grin. She didn't answer him immediately, only glancing up at him briefly. "I'm sure," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. There was no challenge in her tone, no defensiveness, just a quiet assurance that made him hesitate for a moment. But his cocky attitude quickly returned, and he couldn't help but laugh to himself. He stepped back and rejoined his friends, shaking his head. "I'll bet she's never even held a rifle before," he muttered to his friends, the rest of the group nodding in agreement. They were certain she would miss, and that they would enjoy watching her fail. The elderly woman didn't react. Instead, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she focused on the target in the distance. She adjusted her stance ever so slightly, raising the rifle to her shoulder with a fluid motion. It was a graceful movement, almost as if she were moving through a dance. The rifle felt right in her hands, as though it had been an extension of herself for years. She closed one eye, aligning the crosshairs with the target. Time seemed to slow down around her as her focus narrowed. There was no hesitation, no doubt. It was just her and the target. She was completely at peace in this moment, the outside world fading away as her years of experience took over. The sounds of the range, the laughter, and the chatter of the young shooters were no longer important. All that mattered was this one shot. The young shooters, still laughing and joking, didn't notice the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her fingers rested lightly on the trigger. They didn't realize that in those few moments, she wasn't just a woman in her twilight years. She was a master in her element. Then, without any fanfare, the woman pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot rang out, but it wasn't the loud, jarring bang that many of the shooters were used to. It was a clean, sharp sound, echoing through the range with a precise, calculated tone. The woman lowered the rifle gently and took a step back, her eyes still locked on the target. The young shooters didn't immediately understand what had happened. It wasn't until they glanced up at the target that they realized the truth. The bullet had hit the bullseye right in the center, perfectly, without a single deviation. For a few moments there was stunned silence. The shooters stared at the target, their eyes wide with disbelief. They blinked, unsure if they were seeing things correctly. They looked back at the woman, who was now lowering her rifle, her expression still calm and serene, as though hitting the target had been the most natural thing in the world. The cocky young man who had mocked her earlier was the first to speak, though his voice wavered. Okay, that was lucky," he said, trying to shrug it off. "One shot doesn't mean anything." But even he couldn't quite mask the shock on his face. The others, who had been so certain she would miss, were now shifting uncomfortably in their spots. They had all seen her shoot, and they couldn't deny that it was an impressive shot. The woman didn't seem to notice their discomfort. She simply adjusted her stance again, preparing for the next round. Her calm, collected demeanor had an almost eerie quality to it, as if she was performing a task she had done thousands of times before. The young shooters, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of her skill. The once laughable thought of her being a threat suddenly began to weigh on them. The cocky young man, now trying to recover from the surprise, took a step forward. "All right, let's see if you can do it again," he said, his voice still filled with disbelief. But this time there was a hint of uncertainty behind his bravado. The woman didn't respond, didn't even look at him. She simply took another deep breath and raised her rifle once more. The young shooters continued to watch, their eyes now filled with curiosity and tension. What would happen next? Would the old woman prove them wrong again, or was the first shot just a fluke? The room was silent except for the distant sounds of gunfire from other lanes, the quiet hum of air conditioning, and the soft, steady rhythm of the woman's breath as she prepared for her next shot. The room was heavy with tension after the old woman's perfect shot. The sound of the bullet hitting the bullseye still lingered in the air, hanging like a challenge that none of the young shooters could ignore. The laughter had stopped, replaced by awkward silence. The cocky young man who had spoken the most, the one who had mocked her from the start, now stood with his arms crossed, looking as if he had been slapped. His confident grin was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow, as though trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Well, that was a fluke," he muttered under his breath, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He turned to his friends, but none of them responded. They were all staring at the target in disbelief. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. They were the ones with the modern rifles, the top-of-the-line scopes, and the experience. They were the ones who had been practicing for tournaments, the ones who had earned their place at this range. How could this old woman with her worn-out rifle possibly beat them with one shot? One of the younger shooters, a tall man with dark hair, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe it was just luck," he said, but it didn't sound convincing. His eyes were still on the target, as though waiting for it to somehow change. He wanted to believe that the shot was an accident, but deep down he knew better. The woman, however, didn't seem concerned. She was still focused on the next target, her hands steady as she adjusted the sights on her rifle. The young shooters couldn't help but watch her. There was a calmness to her movements, a quiet assurance that made them feel like amateurs in comparison. They had been so busy showing off to each other, trying to prove who was the best, that they hadn't noticed how much they had been overlooking. And now, here was this woman, who seemed so out of place yet so in control of her craft. The cocky shooter, still trying to save face, turned to his friends. "Come on, let's do a proper challenge then. If she thinks she can shoot, let's see if she can keep up." His tone was less taunting now, more competitive, but it wasn't just about proving a point anymore. There was a new edge in his voice, one that came from the realization that he had just underestimated someone who could very well be a master of the craft. The woman didn't look at them as they gathered around her. She simply nodded, acknowledging their challenge without saying a word. Her calm, composed attitude was starting to unsettle them. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She was just there ready to shoot again, as though it were nothing unusual. The shooters, now fully aware that they were in a real competition, adjusted their stances. They knew they couldn't afford to look weak now. If they did, they might never live it down. The young man with the cocky grin stepped up first, his rifle held tight in his hands. He gave a short, confident glance at the woman. "All right, let's see if you can beat this," he said, though it wasn't clear whether he was talking to her or trying to reassure himself. He aimed at the target, his posture perfect, his concentration unwavering. He was quick, his movements sharp, as though he were putting every ounce of his energy into each shot. He pulled the trigger, and the sound of the rifle echoed through the room. His shot hit the target, but it wasn't a bullseye. It was off-center, about 2 inches to the left. A few of the shooters glanced at each other, their expressions a mix of surprise and hesitation. They had been expecting perfection, expecting the cocky shooter to show them all how it was done. Instead, they saw something else, the reality that hitting a target under pressure wasn't as easy as it looked. The cocky shooter cursed under his breath. "I was just warming up," he muttered, trying to save face. He adjusted his position, but the woman didn't react. She was still calm, still focused, her rifle resting against her shoulder as she took aim. One by one, the other shooters took their turns, each trying to prove they could hit the target better than the last. But no matter how many times they shot, they couldn't match the precision they had witnessed in the old woman's first shot. Each time there was a slight imperfection, an inch to the left, an inch to the right, a miss entirely. They were good shots, no doubt about it, but none of them were able to hit the center of the target as perfectly as she had done. As the competition went on, the young shooters became more and more frustrated. Their pride was on the line, and the woman's unflinching demeanor was starting to get to them. Each shot they took seemed to fall short of the mark, and each glance they threw her way showed that she wasn't feeling the same pressure. To her, this wasn't a battle of egos, it was just another day on the range. One of the shooters, a lanky guy with dark-rimmed glasses, started to pace back and forth. "She must be cheating. There's no way she's that good," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. He was now looking at the woman with suspicion, wondering if there was some trick behind her calmness, some way she had managed to make that first shot. The woman heard him but said nothing. She knew that no amount of words could change their perception. She wasn't here to prove herself to them. She was here because this was her passion, her craft. She had lived a life of shooting, of training, of precision, and now all of that experience was coming into play. For her, the pressure of the moment didn't exist. It was simply muscle memory, honed through years of practice. The shooters, though still determined, began to lose their focus. Their hands started to shake slightly, their breaths growing shorter as the challenge continued. The woman, however, was still steady, still calm. She lined up her shot, adjusted the sights, and pulled the trigger. The sound was sharp and clear, the bullet hitting the center of the target once again. Another bull's. The young shooters stood there in stunned silence. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. This wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. This woman, who they had dismissed as just another elderly spectator, was a master of the craft, and they were beginning to understand just how much they had underestimated her. The cocky shooter, his pride bruised, took a deep breath and stepped forward again. "All right, let's have another round," he said, trying to sound confident, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his swagger had disappeared. Now there was only a quiet determination in his eyes. He needed to prove something, not just to the woman, but to himself. The tension in the room was palpable. The group of young shooters, once so sure of themselves, now found themselves in a race against time to see if they could outshoot a woman who, until moments ago, they had thought was no match for them. What they didn't realize was that the true competition wasn't against her. It was against their own egos. As the competition continued, the young shooters were starting to feel the weight of the situation. The room, once filled with their loud, confident voices, was now quieter. They no longer joked with each other or threw playful insults. The shots they fired were no longer met with laughter or high-fives, but with a hushed silence and uneasy glances at the woman who, despite her age, seemed to be outmatching them at every turn. Each one of them had taken their best shots, and each one had failed to beat her. The cocky young man who had once been so full of bravado now stood with his rifle in hand, looking down at the target. His forehead was beaded with sweat, his face red with frustration. He couldn't remember the last time he'd missed so many shots in a row. It was humiliating, and even though he tried to keep his composure, his eyes kept drifting to the elderly woman, who was still standing calmly at her lane, waiting for her turn as if there was no pressure at all. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, pulling the stock tighter into his shoulder. He had to make this shot. He had to prove that he was the best. But as he lined up his shot, his hands trembled slightly. He was no longer as sure of himself as he had been at the start. He took a deep breath and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and once again it didn't land where he had hoped. The bullet hit the target, but it was off-center, several inches to the right of the bullseye. A perfect shot was what he had promised himself, but what he had delivered was a reminder of how far he was from matching the woman's skill. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. His friends, who had once shared in his confident laughter, now looked at him with pity in their eyes. No one said anything, but the tension in the air was thick. It was as if everyone could feel the collective disappointment of not living up to the challenge that the woman had set. The elderly woman, meanwhile, hadn't even glanced at the target after she fired her shot. She didn't need to. She knew what had happened. She knew that it was her years of experience, her careful practice, and the many lessons learned over time that had made her so successful. She wasn't surprised by the perfect shots she was hitting, but she wasn't gloating either. Her expression remained calm, unbothered by the reactions around her. There was no need to boast, no need to rub her skill in their faces. She wasn't here for their approval. She was simply here to shoot, and it was as if everything else had faded away, leaving only her and the rifle. The shooters, though, weren't so composed. They continued to shoot, each time hoping for a perfect result, but each time falling short. The young man with the cocky smile tried again, his fingers tightening around the trigger, his eyes narrowing. He lined up the shot, aimed, and fired. This time, the shot landed closer to the center, but it still wasn't perfect. A few inches off, just enough to make it clear that he wasn't quite on her level. The other shooters, one by one, took their turns. Each of them fired with hope, each of them determined to show the old woman that they were better, but none of them could match her. They couldn't figure out how she did it. They couldn't figure out why she was so calm, so collected, while they were all a bundle of nerves, their hands shaking as they pulled the trigger. The difference was clear. She had experience. She had been there before, many times over. And no amount of modern equipment, no amount of practice, could make up for years of experience like hers. The shooters began to look at each other, their pride bruised. It wasn't just their skills being tested now, it was their egos. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. They had thought she was nothing more than an old woman, someone who couldn't possibly compete with them. But now, it was becoming clear that they were the ones who had misjudged the situation. The cocky young man, no longer able to hide his frustration, threw down his rifle. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, kicking at the ground. He turned away from the range, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had thought this would be an easy win, a chance to show off in front of his friends. Instead, he was leaving with his pride shattered, and there was no escaping it. He had been bested by a woman who, to him, had seemed like an easy target. The other shooters were quiet now. They looked at each other, unsure of what to say. The woman, still standing at her lane, had turned back to her rifle, adjusting it once more and taking careful aim. She had already shown them her skill. She had already proven her point. And now there was no need for her to say anything. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. The shooters watched her in silence. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It was about respect. They had mocked her, laughed at her, assumed she was nothing more than an old woman who didn't know her way around a gun. And now, they were beginning to realize just how wrong they had been. As the final round of shooting came to a close, the cocky young man, still seething with frustration, stepped forward one last time. He couldn't leave like this. He had to try again, had to prove that he could outshoot her, that he could at least match her. This time he took extra care in his aim, focusing intently on the target ahead. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and for the briefest moment it looked like it might land perfectly. But then, as the bullet hit the target, it was clear that he had missed once again. The woman once again had hit the bullseye. Her shot was flawless, as if it had been an effortless act. The shooters stood in stunned silence. They couldn't deny it anymore. They couldn't pretend that this was just a fluke. She was, without a doubt, the better shooter. And it was clear that they had been outmatched. The cocky young man slowly lowered his rifle, his hands shaking slightly. He turned toward the woman, his face a mixture of respect and disbelief. You're really good," he said quietly, his voice no longer filled with mockery but with genuine admiration. The woman, with a calm smile, nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice still soft but steady. She didn't need to say more. The respect had been earned, not through words but through action. The young shooters were still reeling from Mabel's earlier shots. Their pride, which had once been so solid, now felt shaky. They had never imagined someone so small, so old-looking, could outperform them so effortlessly. For a few moments, the shooting range was silent, except for the faint hum of the air vents and the distant clatter of targets being set up in the far corner. Mabel, however, stood quietly, her hands steady on her rifle, her eyes calm but sharp. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't seem to notice the tension around her. Finally, one of the young shooters, a tall man named Derek, cleared his throat and forced a laugh. "Okay, that was lucky," he said, trying to sound confident. "No way you can do that again, it's just a fluke." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his nervousness. The others nodded quickly, agreeing, though none of them really believed it. Mabel didn't respond. She simply adjusted her stance, her movements precise and practiced. It was a rhythm that suggested she had done this countless times before. She didn't rush, she didn't hurry. She waited until the targets were perfectly aligned in her sight. Then she fired one shot. Dead center, the target shook and fell. Another shot, perfect again. The young shooters froze, their eyes widened, their mouths opening slightly, but no words came out. Derek tried again. Okay, maybe a beginner's luck, he muttered, but even he couldn't hide the doubt creeping into his voice. Mabel continued. Each shot hit the bulls. Some were from a distance that would challenge even the best shooters in the range. Some were difficult angles that seemed impossible to hit. But Mabel didn't miss, not once. She moved slowly between targets, her movements almost graceful, almost like a dance. Her old hands were steady, her breathing calm, her eyes focused. Every shot told a story of years of experience, training, and discipline. The young shooters started to whisper among themselves, trying to figure out how she was doing it. She's cheating, one muttered under his breath. There's no way she can be this good, another said. Maybe she had some special gun modifications. But even as they whispered, their own confidence was crumbling. They tried to match her pace, tried to aim as carefully as she did, but their shots were wild, missing targets or barely hitting edges. Derek, trying to regain some sense of control, stepped forward. "All right, that's enough," he said, raising his voice. "We've seen your skill. You win, let's stop the competition here." He tried to sound commanding, but his voice lacked conviction. He could feel the eyes of the other shooters on him, questioning him, challenging him. Mabel slowly lowered her rifle and looked at him. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her calm expression, the quiet authority in her gaze, spoke louder than words. She shook her head ever so slightly, as if to say no. There is still more to learn. Then, without a hint of anger, she began to show them. She started with the basics. She showed them how to hold the rifle properly, how to balance their bodies, and how to control their breathing. She corrected their grips gently, guiding their hands with a quiet patience that made it impossible to resist learning. "You're too tense," she said softly to Derek, adjusting his stance. "Relax, the gun is part of you, not something you fight against." Her voice was calm, but her presence was commanding. Slowly, the young shooters began to realize that what they had thought was arrogance or luck was actually years of skill, practice, and discipline. Mabel wasn't just accurate. She understood every detail of shooting. She knew how to control the recoil, how to anticipate the target's movement, how to stay focused when the pressure was high. She didn't scold them for mocking her earlier. She didn't show anger. She only corrected mistakes, explained techniques, and demonstrated shots with precision. She even let them try again, guiding their hands when needed, showing them how to aim for angles they had never considered. As the minutes passed, the young shooters' attitude began to change. Their faces, once full of arrogance, now showed concentration and respect. They listened carefully to every word Mabel said. They followed her instructions, and slowly their shots began to improve. They were still not as skilled as she was, but they were learning faster than they ever had before. Derek looked at her and felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and awe. He had mocked her, underestimated her, and now he realized how wrong he had been. I didn't think anyone could do this," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. You're amazing." Mabel smiled faintly, just a small curve of her lips. "It's not about being amazing," she said gently. "It's about discipline, practice, and respect. Respect for the weapon, respect for the target, and respect for yourself." Her words hit them harder than any lecture could. They realized that all their bragging, all their confidence had come from arrogance, not skill. They had looked down on her because of her age, her appearance, her quiet demeanor, but none of that mattered when true skill was on display. The lesson Mabel gave that day was not just about shooting. It was about humility. About understanding that skill, patience, and focus mattered more than pride or arrogance. She didn't yell. She didn't punish them. She simply showed them a better way, and in doing so, left a lasting impression on every person present. By the end of the session, the elitists were no longer laughing or mocking. They were focused, disciplined, and respectful. They were still learning, but now with humility instead of pride. And Mabel. She packed up her rifle, adjusted her bag, and prepared to leave just as quietly as she had arrived. She gave a small nod to the young shooters, who now looked at her with awe and gratitude. Derek whispered almost reverently, I hope I can be that good someday." Mabel smiled and said nothing, but her eyes held a gentle promise. Skill and respect could always be learned if one had patience and the right teacher. As she walked out of the range, the echoes of her shots lingered in the minds of the young shooters. The lesson she had taught was clear, unforgettable, and far more valuable than any competition win. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And in that quiet, unassuming way, Mabel's legend grew, not through arrogance or boastful stories, but through action, skill, and the quiet authority of someone who had lived a life mastering her craft. After Mabel had finished teaching, the atmosphere at the shooting range had completely changed. The young shooters who had mocked her earlier were no longer laughing, joking, or bragging. Instead, there was a quiet respect in the air, almost like a weight pressing down on them, a recognition that they had been shown something extraordinary. For a few moments, no one spoke, as if no words could match what had just happened. Mabel moved slowly toward her bag, her steps measured and calm. She had spent hours showing the young shooters the correct way to hold a rifle, to aim, and to control their breathing. She had corrected every mistake, demonstrated impossible shots, and yet she carried herself with a quiet humility. She didn't need to announce her skill. She didn't need applause. Her actions spoke for themselves. Derek, the tall young man who had led the mocking earlier, felt a strange mix of shame and admiration. He had underestimated Mabel from the moment she walked onto the range. He had thought her age and small frame meant she was weak, unskilled, and slow. Now he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't just skilled, she was a master. Every movement, every shot, every word carried the weight of decades of experience. "Thank you," Derek said quietly, almost reverently. His voice was soft, but it carried a sincerity that surprised even him. I don't know what to say. I didn't think anyone could do what you just did." Mabel looked at him and smiled faintly, just a small, gentle curve of her lips. "You don't need to say anything," she replied. Her voice was calm and steady. "What matters is that you've learned something today. You can take that and build on it. That's more important than winning or losing." The other young shooters, who had been standing nearby, nodded in agreement. They no longer carried the arrogance they had arrived with. Instead, their eyes showed a mixture of awe, humility, and curiosity. They had expected a frail old woman who would fail spectacularly, but instead they had met a true legend. One of them, a shorter young man named Alex, stepped forward. He looked nervous but determined. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "would it be okay if we practiced more with you? I mean, if you don't mind showing us a few more techniques?" Mabel's smile widened just slightly. She reached down and adjusted her rifle in its case. "Of course," she said. "Practice is how you improve, but remember, it's not just about hitting the target. It's about focus, patience, and respect. If you rush or let your ego control you, it won't matter how good your aim is." The young shooters nodded, listening intently. They followed her instructions carefully as she set up new targets. She showed them how to read the range, how to anticipate the target's movement, and how to stay calm even when pressure was high. Each time they made a mistake, she corrected them gently, guiding their hands, adjusting their stances, and showing them how to breathe properly. Hours passed quickly. The young shooters had started the day thinking they were superior, but now they were learning more in a single afternoon than they had in years of practice. Every shot they fired was influenced by Mabel's guidance, every movement sharpened by her experience. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, they had transformed, not just as shooters but as people. The range quieted down. The targets were lined up perfectly, the bullets had been counted and scored, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the lesson they had learned. Arrogance and mockery could never replace skill, patience, or respect. They had seen the power of discipline in action, and it had humbled them. Mabel packed up her equipment slowly, making sure every piece was secure. She didn't rush. She didn't glance back at the young shooters with pride or satisfaction. She simply moved with the calm assurance of someone who had done this many times before. As she slung her bag over her shoulder, she looked at each of them once more. "You've all done well today," she said. "Remember what I showed you and don't forget the most important lesson. Skill alone isn't enough. Respect yourself, respect your tools, and respect those around you. That is how you truly succeed." The young shooters nodded, their expressions reflecting a mix of gratitude and awe. Derek stepped forward once more, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am, I think I speak for all of us when I say we're sorry for mocking you earlier. We didn't know. We judged you without understanding, and thank you for showing us the right way." Mabel smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Apologies aren't necessary," she said. "What matters is that you've learned. That is more valuable than words." The young shooters watched in silence as she made her way toward the exit. Each step was deliberate, graceful, and full of quiet confidence. She didn't look back, but they all felt her presence lingering in the room, a reminder of the lesson she had taught, the skill she had displayed, and the humility she had embodied. As she stepped outside, the air was cool and crisp. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mabel took a deep breath, savoring the calm after the excitement of the day. She adjusted her bag and began walking down the quiet street, her figure small but her presence commanding. People passing by didn't notice her, and that suited her just fine. She didn't need recognition. Her skill and her lessons spoke louder than any applause could. Meanwhile, back at the range, the young shooters were still processing everything. Derek shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe we underestimated her," he said. Alex nodded silently, staring at the targets as if they held a new meaning. She's a legend," he whispered. "I didn't just see amazing shots. I saw a lifetime of experience, of dedication. And I think I finally understand what it means to respect someone like that." The other young shooters agreed, each quietly reflecting on the day's events. The mocking laughter, the arrogance, and the pride that had once filled the range were gone. In their place was a new sense of humility and determination. They knew they had a long way to go before reaching Mabel's level, but they also knew the path forward. They had been given a gift, a glimpse into mastery, patience, and true skill. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, casting long shadows across the range, Mabel's influence lingered. Her lesson was not just about shooting, it was about life. She had shown that age, appearance, or assumptions about someone's abilities mattered little compared to focus, dedication, and respect. The young shooters had learned more than they had expected, and they would carry that lesson with them forever. Days later, stories of the old woman at the range spread quietly among local shooting enthusiasts. People spoke in hushed tones about her skill, her calm demeanor, and the way she had humbly taught a group of arrogant young shooters a lesson they would never forget. No one knew much about her past, and that only added to the mystique. Some said she was a retired champion. Others whispered that she had once trained military sharpshooters, but no one could dispute what they had seen that day. Mabel was extraordinary, and Mabel. She continued on her way, walking through quiet streets, visiting small shops, and living her life with the same calm, measured steps she had shown at the range. She didn't need fame, recognition, or attention. The lessons she had shared, the respect she had earned, and the skill she had demonstrated were enough. Her legend wasn't built on stories or headlines. It was built on action, humility, and the quiet power of a lifetime of mastery. For the young shooters, the day would never be forgotten. They returned to the range again and again, practicing with renewed focus, recalling her words and striving to improve. Every shot they fired carried a part of her lesson. Skill without humility was nothing, and true mastery required patience, respect, and discipline. And somewhere far away from the echoes of the range, Mabel smiled to herself, knowing that the seeds of knowledge she had planted would grow. She walked on, small in stature but vast in influence, a true legend living quietly among the ordinary world.